Hi, Meena. I think you can go live now.
Okay, hi. Good morning or good evening, everyone, depending on which side of the prime meridian we are. Welcome to session 6 of this conference, Societal Impact of Commerce, Sustainability, Technology, and Social Good. This session will be focused on discussing some manifestations of inequality. We, of course, 2 days or one session isn't enough to discuss inequality or the unequal distribution of goods and services around the globe. But we are going to be doing it from a historic, philosophical, and an empirical perspective in the next 1 hour or so. Feel free, for those of you who are in the audience who don't get their questions answered during this session, to send an email to any of the Jindal Global people on this call, or to me. My email address is rishim@seattleu.edu. We've all been witness to rising levels of inequality. To wit, India suffered its I think which was second wave or the third wave of the pandemic, and the extreme inequity and inequality in the distribution of vaccines was self-evident. And quite simply, inequality led to deaths. And an Oxfam report published very early this year, I think in January of 2022, a very stark statistic came up, which talked a little bit about how inequality has indirectly or directly contributed to the death of at least one person every 4 seconds. Compare this to what has happened since the pandemic began, which has resulted in aggrandizement or the doubling of the wealth of the world's richest people since the beginning of the pandemic, which people mark from March 2020. The incomes of 90% of humanity are worse off, but 10% of humanity is doing very well. So, the Oxfam report, of course, talks a little bit about economic inequality, gender inequality, and racial inequality, or unequal access to opportunities. But today we're going to focus with our 3 panelists on different, modes or modalities of examining, or lenses of examining inequality. We'll be looking at historic origins and philosophical underpinnings, as well as looking at some data from India. So let me briefly talk to you about our 3 panelists for today. We have Dr. Stacey Jones as the first presenter. She is a senior lecturer in the Department of Economics at Seattle University, and she actually works in the area of economic history, with a direct emphasis on the trajectory of inequality and the transformation of women's economic role. She has just published a book called Income Inequality in America. And what she is going to do is trace sort of inequalities waves in the United States over the long run, and put our discussion on inequality in sort of a context. She'll provide a US-based context. And she'll probably give us some policies or ways forward. Okay, tall order, Stacey, but you're up to it. We also have Mark Cohen joining us as a second speaker for today. He's a professor of management, and he's a philosopher, but is working as a professor in the Department of Management at the Albers School of Business at Seattle U. In his previous life, he was a banker, so quite in place with the Jindal Global School of Banking and Finance. So he's going to discuss some philosophical underpinnings on inequality. He's probably going to be referring to John Rawls's ideas about inequality. We're all aware of the veil of ignorance. And lastly, we have Dr. Shomidip Roy. He is not just an associate professor, but also an assistant dean at the Jindal Global School of Banking and Finance. Someday you have to tell me how you wear these hats. Dr. Roy actually is an empirical economist and works in applied microeconomics. And his field is labor economics. And he's currently looking at gender gaps or gender inequality. So he fits right into the theme of various kinds of inequality that we are looking at. He's a data scientist and uses data from the Center of Monitoring in the Indian Economy, CMIE. And he's going to talk about the informal nature of labor contracts in India and how that engenders, fosters inequalities. Okay. And I would like to just introduce myself. I am a professor of economics at Seattle University. And unknown to many, or known to just Shamadeep and I, we have a share, an institution in common. I did my master's from Jawaharlal Nehru University, where Professor Roy also attended. So we are co-alums of that institution. So without further ado, I'm going to request Stacy to begin her presentation. Go ahead, Stacy.
Sure, thank you. Let me share my screen so you can see some slides as I'm presenting. Right, first I just want to thank Professor Meenakshi for inviting me to be part of this group today, and also give you a little bit of a forewarning that I'm going to be covering inequality over the course of US history from the colonial period to the present, so it's going to be quite a whirlwind tour, and it'll move quickly, and move quickly in part because I'm so eager to hear what my colleagues have to say who are also on this panel about inequality. All right, so rising inequality is a global issue, and paradoxically at the same time we have decreasing inequality across countries but increasing inequality within countries, and this rise in inequality creates economic, political, and moral challenges. Pope Francis has even tweeted that inequality is the root of social evil. So given the occasion, I wanted to begin by juxtaposing inequality in the United States with inequality in India. So if you look at the green line, that's the share of income going to the bottom 50% of households in India. The saffron line is the share of income going to the top 1% of households. And you can clearly see, the crossover where the top 1% is gaining and the bottom 50% is losing. Similar for the red and blue lines. Red line is the income share of the top 1% in the US, and you see a similar rise in inequality in the US as you do in India. And this current trend toward rising inequality is evident in both countries, but there's certainly variability across countries in the extent to which inequality is rising, with the US and the Anglo-Saxon countries sort of at the top of the list in terms of the degree of the rise in inequality. So one thing I want to do is I want to split this graph in half. So if we look at the decades prior to 1980, if you were to glean a trend from this at all, it would be that inequality is actually falling or staying relatively stable. And in fact, it was during this time, during the 1970s, where economist Henry Aaron wrote this sort of famous comment that's since been, kind of not very historically accurate, that following changes in the income distribution is like watching the grass grow. Inequality was a really boring subject in the 1970s and 80s because it wasn't changing much. And then along come the mid-70s or the 80s, and the other half of the picture is this striking rise in inequality, across industrialized nations. So you have this real contrast between, it seemed like the income distribution was very, very stable, and then the past 5 decades where income inequality has been on this rise that seems, almost unstoppable. So this is where kind of a historical perspective comes in. I want to take this idea of different phases in history and apply it to the US history of inequality in the very long run. So look at what periods was inequality stable, falling, rising. Briefly describe forces that have shaped that trajectory of inequality, and extract some lessons from that history for inequality going forward. So this graph is looking at top-end inequality in the US over the very, very long run. So the starts back in 1774. And, of course, the further we go back in history, the fuzzier the data, and we could probably have we could have an entire conference on clarifying exactly where these points belong on the graph. But the two real simple lessons there are that certainly the inequality story has not been a monotonic, continuous rise in inequality. It's an episodic story. There have been rises in long periods of rising inequality, periods of falling inequality, And once again, we're in a period of rising inequality, but there's nothing inevitable about that rise, and there's no reason that it can't turn around. And if we break this history into periods, again, this is a whirlwind tour, but economic history historians have identified sort of phases in America's, or chapters in America's inequality story, beginning with the colonial period, in which America, for at least the white colonists, was a remarkably economically mobile place full of opportunity, abundant land. Of course, I say abundant land, recognizing that that land was the land of Native American peoples before the colonists arrived. So, it's a very complex story. But in terms of the white colonial economy, there was a great deal of opportunity. Of course, again, balancing that story of opportunity with the fact of slavery, which in fact, the Domar hypothesis attributes the persistence of slavery in part to the land abundance and the labor shortage conditions of the colonies, right? Because in a conditions of labor shortage and abundant land, who would be willing to do low wage work on a farm if they could just start their own farm, right? So that is one of the explanations given for the persistence of slavery. Beginning around the 1800s, 1790, we have the first great rise in inequality. And this is along the lines of the Simon Kunis' hypothesis that says as economies develop, we'll see growing inequality due to urbanization and industrialization. Only a certain part of the population is taking part in the new opportunities created by economic development. And that persists throughout both the antebellum era and then through the Civil War era, right into the Gilded Age, where you have this long rise in inequality over the course of the 1800s, well into the 1900s. And then there's a sharp break around the 1910s. World War I might be one of the markers of that, especially in the European countries, where we begin a period called the Great Leveling, where there's a marked decline in inequality in almost every industrial nation. Part of the explanation in the US that's given by economic historians, especially Claudia Golden, Lawrence Katz, is the great investments in education that happened, the upskilling of the labor force that happened in the US, the high school movement of the 10s and 20s, followed by the rise of higher education in the post-war decades as part of the explanation for declining inequality throughout the 1900s, right up until about 1970, the mid-70s. Some people even mark 1977 as a break point. And then we see this resumption of rising inequality, which some economics historians have called avoidable. The political context shifts its emphasis from kind of shared prosperity and an implicit agreement between labor and capital that the rewards will be shared, which some economists and historians have labeled the Treaty of Detroit, kind of an implicit political agreement around shared prosperity, which you see broken when Ronald Reagan fires the air traffic controllers in the 80s, to a political context that supports and in some ways encourages rising inequality, and that seems to be what we're still in today. So again, this was very fast, and I'm sure we could debate, many points of this story, but that's kind of the overview. Opportunity at the beginning, the first rise of the industrial economy, long growth in inequality in the 1800s, reversal in the 1910s to 1970s. And that follows basically the pattern that Simon Kuznets, Nobel Prize winning economist, basically the inventor or the constructor of GDP among many accomplishments, but also the first empirical student of inequality in the long run, who posited this inverse U-shape picture to inequality, where you'd see rising inequality as economies developed, and then falling inequality as democratic institutions ensured that the fruits of inequality were shared by all. Now, in the US, we saw that rise, we saw that fall, but then we're seeing it's not just an inverted U, but it's a W. Inequality is rising again. Forces that shape the path of inequality, political shocks, the size of the labor force, the level of education and skills, the degree of trade competition, technological change that favors either low-skilled or high-skilled laborers, and the finance sector has been a large driver of inequality. In terms of making predictions about where this will go, especially with regard to political shocks right now, we all know that that's fairly unpredictable. Size of the labor force is supposed to shrink in the US in the upcoming decades, which should reduce inequality. Some economic historians are optimistically predicting some upscaling of the labor force in the US, which would reduce inequality, but continued competition from low-wage countries would tend to increase inequality in upcoming decades. Hard to predict where technological change is going to go. And we expect booms and busts in the finance sector to continue to lead to upswings and downswings in inequality. So putting all those predictions together, the typical economist's answer, on the one hand, on the other hand, we're not sure where inequality is going to go in the next decade. So a few lessons to draw from this very long view of history. The first is that there's no simplistic one-factor explanation of inequality. So whether we're thinking about Marxian class struggle or Piketty's R is greater than G, none of these one-factor explanations seems to fit. Second takeaway, in the long run, empirically, there doesn't seem to be evidence of a trade-off between efficiency and equity. So some of the periods of most rapid growth, like the 1950s and 60s, were also the most equitable periods of US economic history. Third point, third takeaway, rising inequality is not inevitable. We've seen inequality rise and fall over the long run. And if we want inequality to fall, we can think about both redistribution in terms of taxes and transfers and what people are calling pre-distribution. So adjusting pre-tax income, for example, by aligning incentives in the tax code better in terms of rewarding capital versus labor. And the final takeaway is that this story is still unfolding and that our decisions today will shape the next chapter of what happens with inequality. And let me stop there, and I look forward to hearing from my colleagues about other dimensions of inequality.
Fabulous. Thank you, Stacey, and thank you for presenting us this whirlwind tour of income inequality trends. That when we're done with this back and forth, I would like to talk to you a little bit about Daron Acemoglu's attack on technology as something that has actually widened the economic disparity, at least in the United States. And we'll discuss the example of the horse, because the horse was everywhere until it wasn't. Talk about workers as horses, which may not be an appropriate comparison, but it's still a trend of what happens to people when they get replaced. Okay, on to you, Mark. Let's listen to some philosophical underpinnings on inequality. Mark, are you able to present?
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Sorry, I was busy presenting, but I was on mute. So I wanted to thank Stacey. That was super interesting, and I have a couple questions myself. A lot of questions. I want to focus some on, well, my title says philosophical perspectives, and I want to especially focus on the reasons that we object to inequality. And I want to try to distinguish between what a philosopher would call instrumental reasons and intrinsic reasons. So the philosophical discussion of inequality starts here with John Rawls' book, Theory of Justice, published in 1971. It's 525 pages of like dense argument and small print. This is my favorite page, and we'll come back to it in a second. Rawls's overall project in theory and in much of his later work, though not all, but much of it, is to reconstruct the social contract tradition and repair what he sees as certain problems. So these two principles of justice are at the core of the work. And we'll come back to the specific content of them. But Rawls argues that citizens should choose these two principles. The logic is this: citizens are committed to freedom, equality, and society being a fair system of social cooperation. That's like the core of the liberal tradition. And given those commitments, these are the principles of justice citizens ought to choose. Sometimes people categorize Rawls as an egalitarian, but that's actually not exactly right. The second principle explicitly allows for inequality. So if he is an egalitarian, it's a peculiar sort. So one reason to restrict inequality is this from Rawls. And this is instrumental reasoning. A free market system must be set within a framework of political and legal institutions that adjust the long-run trend of economic forces so as to prevent excessive concentrations of poverty and wealth, especially those likely to lead to political domination. So the view is that inequality is dangerous because it leads to political domination, and that's unacceptable. But the intrinsic considerations are really doing most of the work in Rawls's thinking. So let's look in particular at the content of the second part of the second principle of justice, and that's highlighted in purple. The second principle says that social and economic inequalities must satisfy two conditions. The second condition is that they are to be to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society. This is called the difference principle. The principle is often seen and applied in terms as an acknowledgement of and demand that we address poverty, and that could be the result, but that's not the primary motivation in Rawls's part. The idea is that we are all better off by allowing for some inequality, and the inequalities can be justified if the least advantaged themselves are made most off. That's the content of the difference principle. So this is a passage from a later restatement that emphasizes the core moral commitment, the part that's in orange. The principles of justice, the principles of a democratic conception of justice, what he calls them here, specify the fair terms of cooperation between citizens so conceived, the fair terms of cooperation. So this is the logic. This is the logic, I think. The key intuition is society should be a fair system of social cooperation. Fair means reciprocal or mutual. So everyone who contributes to society as a whole ought to benefit. It's wrong then if one group is benefiting at the expense of the other. You saw this in Stacey Jones's chart where the lines begin to diverge. The lines are diverging. The 1% is gaining at the expense of the 50%. I think it was 50% in the bottom line. That means one group is gaining at the expense of another, and that is unjust or wrong. That's the sort of the moral logic in Rawls's thinking. It's the commitment to society being a fair system of social cooperation that does the work. This all sounds like very economic, and it is economic, but there is a moral vision here, and this would take us far afield and would take up a lot of time. But I just want to at least note these two comments. We need one another as partners in ways of life that are engaged in for their own sake. The successes and enjoyments of others are necessary for and complementary to our own good. And then it is through social union, founded on the needs and potentialities of its members, that each person can participate in the total sum of the realized natural assets of the others. So what Rawls means is that we are all constructing society together, and we all bring our own talents and abilities, and social union amounts to an agreement that we all share in the benefits of each other's abilities. It's a profound moral vision that's doing the work for Rawls. So that's a crash course in Rawls. I want to say two other things, or kind of shift gears for a couple of minutes and look at the questions about inequality from a different perspective. There's a separate instrumental reason to object to inequality that comes from the social psychologists. And this will be super fast, but there's evidence that wealth makes people less empathetic. Socioeconomic factors predict responses to suffering, and indeed predict that wealthier people are less responsive and less empathetic. A second finding, and this is especially jarring for a social and moral philosopher like me, higher social class predicts increased unethical behavior. This study involved a very concrete and very objective experiment. The researchers counted how many cars ran red lights, and it turns out that drivers of more expensive cars are more likely to run red lights. This got a great deal of press in the United States. If you drive an expensive car, you're probably a jerk, scientists say. So together, these studies, and this really represents a whole literature now, these studies suggest that inequality can threaten social solidarity. And that would be instrumental reason to object to inequality. But I do think we have to be very careful here. The reference in these papers is to wealth and social class, but it's not clear if inequality is what does the work. It's not clear if inequality is the threat to social solidarity or wealth. And to me, that raises a hard question about whether or not the practical focus on inequality is actually somewhat misplaced. And so I want to say something about this, and then I will be done. A few months ago, there was a tragic fire in Philadelphia, a city on the East Coast of the United States. I went to graduate school in Philadelphia, and we have friends there. I saw the news, and I spent all this time trying to figure out where the fire was. And I found this paragraph in a newspaper article. Philadelphia's housing costs are not nearly as high as those in cities like New York or San Francisco or Seattle. A safe and affordable place to live is still out of reach for tens of thousands of the city's residents. Nearly a quarter of its population is below the poverty line. Among families headed by single mothers, like the victims in the recent fire, the number rises to 42%. That's an astonishing number, an astonishing statistic. My colleague, Stacy Jones, helped me sort of sort out other pieces of data. 2016, the supplemental poverty measure, which is it's a corrected measure. It's a measure of poverty that's corrected to take into account government transfers to people who are poor to help address and reduce poverty. This rate was slightly higher than the official measure of 44.8 million people. That's an astonishing number of poor people in the United States. And one other thing, like social mobility in the United States is much weaker than we would expect. The census tract that you're born into in large measure determines your outcomes. So what I want to suggest, sort of across these three last points, is that many complaints about inequality are really complaints about poverty. It's really poverty that is objectionable. It's poverty that represents the moral failing. And the inequality, the fact that there are some very rich people while there are some very poor people, makes the moral wrong of poverty that much worse. And this is also a theme in Rawls's work. Rawls is fundamentally concerned with the passage here. We need measures ensuring for all citizens adequate all-purpose means to make effective use of their freedoms. It's like a very philosophical way to put it. But the idea is that we have all these freedoms and liberties, and if you can't make use of them, it's a kind of destruction of a beautiful human potential. And that's what's really objectionable. If we lived in a world where there was no poverty, it's not clear that inequality would itself be a problem. And that's sort of what I'd like to talk about with the rest of the panelists too. Thanks.
Thanks. Thank you, Mark. I keep reminding myself that you're really a philosopher. And I'd really like that last bit about what the moral objection is. It's actually the existence of poverty. Why is inequality abhorrent? The idea, and I'll bring it probably up in the discussions, is that I actually, when I moved to the United States for graduate school, watched a lot of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And I felt that the integrity of society should be like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Yeah. And I tried to, over the years, and I don't want to date myself on how many years it has been, I've been trying to think about what is it about the integrity of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood that current society lacks. And I think you have very very appropriately and aptly pointed us in directions that make us question why the other neighborhoods should be more like Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. And I think we'll talk more about that in the discussions. Of course, inequality has it's bad because it sucks. I mean, not just because of poverty, it produces democracies. Even Rawls admitted to that. A democracy cannot function. And capitalism has proven to be a good system of maybe efficient allocation, but not equitable allocation of resources. And I kind of connected it with Stacey's point about how there's no trade-off between efficiency and equity, at least from a historic lens. From this balcony view of inequality and a very laser-focused view of inequality in the United States, we move now to India and to Dr. Somadip Roy, who's going to talk about labor force participation and bring it down to sort of a gender lens. So go ahead, Somadip. It's the floor or the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Meenakshi. I don't have a presentation, so I'm going to speak as is. It's really great to be part of this panel, and I really enjoyed the first two panelists. Something that Mark said about the moral side of inequality is going to connect to what I'm going to talk about. So I am going to talk about how the labor market contributes to inequality. And not only is it related to the standard of living or poverty, both the United States and India are democracies where inevitably, when the government, a particular political party wants to be elected into government, you will inevitably see, jobs being a part of their manifesto, right? So, handling the labor market well or tackling it well is not only morally and politically important; it's also important for the survival of democracy. So, I'm going to talk about how the labor market contributes to inequality. And in the Indian context. And I'm going to talk about the last few years, which Professor Jones showed where the inequality is actually going up. And in this context, we must mention that India has been, in the news for having what is known as a demographic dividend, right? So India enjoys one of the youngest workforces in the world. The median age was 28. In India, of the working population, whereas it's 37 in China and 45 in Europe. 2/3 of the population in India, which is a very large population, is of working age, which is between the age of 15 and 64. But many others have also said that the million-dollar question is this a demographic dividend or is it a demographic burden, right? And I know I have 10 minutes. I think 10 minutes is not enough time to answer this question, but I'm going to try to answer it in two different ways. So first, I'm going to talk about the informal nature of the labor market in India, and then I'm going to come to gender and then mention a couple of other things. So that's the plan. So let's talk about informalization of labor first, right? Informalization of labor is very high in India. Labor is underpaid. In many occasions, they work under abysmal conditions. And when I say informalization, I don't just mean the informal labor sector. Even the formal labor sector has a lot of informalization within it, inside it, right? So that's what I'm talking about. So even though India has seen significant economic growth since the 90s, there are concerns with regard to productivity or how fragmented the labor market is, right? So there's this paper by Maiti and Sen, which say that this is a conundrum that policymakers face in addressing the large presence of the informal sector in countries such as India, where the objective of policy should be to reduce the size of informality and relegate as many workers as possible to the formal sector, right? So even the Arthur Lewis kind of argument is at play here. But interestingly, there are two diametrically opposite views with regard to the informal sector. So some people think of it as a good thing, and some people think of it as not necessarily a good thing. So I'm going to talk about the more prevalent view, which is that it is a means of exploitation, right? It is somewhere where primitive accumulation takes place. It is completely unregulated, so the employer can treat their employees in ways which are often illegal or unethical. They do not pay them enough. There are no mechanisms for the workers to voice their concerns. Then there's no representation, and often they work in abysmal conditions, right? And people who believe in this view, which is the more prevalent view, they think that the goal of policy should be to bring in similar regulations in the informal sector as are found in the formal sector, right? So that you protect the workers and you make sure that the working conditions and their wages improve. The other point of view is interesting. So the other point of view says that it is in fact the informal sector which is the reason for economic dynamism and Schumpeterian creativity, right? So the Schumpeterian idea of creative destruction is most well seen in the informal sector in India. So how? So the argument here is, typically households and entrepreneurs in lesser developed countries make a transition from very small enterprises in the early stages of capitalism to very large corporations that are omnipresent in late capitalism. So the Walmarts and these big giant corporations in the United States that we see, right? But it was not the case in earlier stages of capitalism. It was a much more informal view, informal labor market. And any regulations or laws which the state attempts to stop this kind of economic dynamism is merely going to weaken the creative energies of the informal sector and bring the growth of informal enterprises to a grinding halt, which will basically be bad for economic growth and the well-being of the larger economy, right? And that, of course, is tied to the idea of inequality. So people who believe in this view say that the most important role that the state can play in encouraging the transition of firms from the informal to the formal sector is to just leave the informal sector alone, right? So this is the free market argument where you don't mess with the informal sector. So completely opposite views. Which view is correct? Professor Stacey said that economists like to say on the one hand this and on the other hand that. That is what the evidence is here as well. And people say that the Indian experience is unique. So Pranab Bardhan has written on this. He says that informalization as a means of exploitation is not consistent with what has been seen in places like China and Vietnam. So the Indian experience is very different. In China and Vietnam, it was focused on outward-oriented manufacturing sector, whereas in India, it is a lot more complex, right? Neither is it consistent with the empirical reality in India, where important sections of the informal sector have found to be contributing in a very major way to the formal sector. So the formal sector and the informal sector are tied together in a very complex, sort of economic supply chain. And if you want to break that, then there'll be catastrophic effects on the formal sector as well, right? So, the typical policy making solution here is that there is no one size fits all solution to the problem. And there needs to be a fine balance between over-regulation and under-regulation, right? So which sectors to regulate and which one not. Which brings me to the second part of what I want to say, which is with regard to gender, right? So when we're talking about institutional and social barriers that contribute to inequality, there are many such factors. So there's caste, there's religion, there's the location where you live in a rural area or an urban area. But the one that I want to talk about is gender, because this is something that is in the news or in academic research in India quite a bit. And the interesting result here is that even though India has grown quite fast for the last 2 decades, India has also seen a sizable fertility, a decline in fertility, a rapid expansion in education, and a decline in the education gender gap, which should all favor women participating in the labor force, right? However, it is really puzzling to see that the reported female labor force participation rate in urban India has stagnated around 18% since the 1980s. And it is declining. Overall, the labor force participation of women is declining. For men, it's going up, although the education levels of women are going up. So this is a paradox that economists are looking at. There are many explanations of this, which I'm going to talk about as much as is possible within this time frame, right? So this goes back to the idea of the demographic dividend, that you have to productively employ your working population, and high and rising female employment levels were in fact crucial in sustaining East Asia's high economic growth, right? So the East Asian countries grew on the back of increasing female labor force participation, which is not happening in India. So the question is, why is this happening, right? There is an issue of underreporting. So the data often does not necessarily reflect how many women are actually participating. But if you look at the literature, what historians and economists have explained, the typical explanation, even in the United States, is that marriage is associated with negative effect on female labor force participation. Childbirth is, or if the income of the household goes up, then in many cases the women drop out of the labor force. So these are all established theories. There's also a motherhood penalty. So even if you join the labor force after you've given birth, then you lose out on wages or promotions in the long run, right? So this is going to contribute to inequality as well. Now, in the Indian context, the most important or the most popular explanation is that this is social norms, right? So the social norm is that women are mostly responsible for doing the domestic chores, and this is an important constraint to Indian women's ability to participate in the paid work, right? And in this context, I want to mention a paper by Ashwini Deshpande and Singh. Ashwini Deshpande is a professor here at Ashoka University, and this is a paper that came out in 2021, where she actually found something very interesting. She said that it's none of these. In fact, she looked at this new data set that is available in India. It's called the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey. And this is brought out by a private organization in India. In India, traditionally, the government data sets have been the gold standard when it comes to research. But this is, one of the first private data sets that people are writing on using. And the advantage here is that it's a high frequency data set. So the same individual is interviewed 3 or 4 times in a year. And what they find here is that it is not, so none of these explanations appear convincing, as what actually happens when you look at the high frequency data is that women enter and exit the labor market several times within a year, sometimes 3 or 4 times, right? And stigma or social norms don't change over short intervals, right? So that cannot explain, right? So they actually say that it is the demand for labor which determines this kind of declining female labor force participation, and it is not the supply side factors which they find, right? So there's more that paper says. I know I'm running out of time. I just want to finish by saying that it's not just the informalization of labor or gender that contributes to growing inequality. When you look at the labor market's contribution to inequality, caste is a very big factor. So the SC/ST population have fallen behind. In some cases, the Muslim population has fallen behind. The upper caste Hindus have done better over time. There's other factors like location. So if you live in a town or in a rural area, will determine your wages and your well-being. And there are other factors as well. But I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Meenakshi.
Thank you, Shramadip. I'm thinking that we should have had an entire day on this conference, because I would have liked to talk about Ashwini's paper with you. In fact, there was a paper by Rohini Pandey that discussed sort of caste based. I was going to ask you about the data, whether it has been split on caste lines, and actually talked about how upper castes women, because of media portrayals of how more successful women actually stay at home, are choosing. So of course, a very much supply-based model. And I'm glad you brought up the demand-based demand side of the story, because demand for work fluctuates and kind of relates to the informality of certain sectors where the demand for labor can fluctuate. And of course, we're going to mention the dreaded D word. There is absolute discrimination against women, because they don't get hired for a job that a man could do, because a man has to support a family. So there are all these socioeconomic explanations. But I'm very cognizant of our time, and we have about 15 minutes. So in the next 5 or 6 minutes, would you like to talk amongst yourselves, if you had, Shomadip, something that you wanted to ask, or likewise, Mark or Stacy? I'm opening it amongst the 3 or 4 of us.
I mean,
go ahead.
I could go ahead if you want. So
go ahead.
Because I was talking about the gender dimension of how that basically contributes to inequality. I would like to know how the situation is with regard to the United States in terms of labor force participation, and how that fits into the overall story.
Stacy, would you? Stacy is an established researcher in that field.
No, I actually just put a paper in the chat. There's a really interesting recent paper, National Bureau of Economic Research, that actually cites rising inequality as a factor that's inhibiting women's labor force participation, because classic income effects. If you have these very high salaries on the part of some, mostly men, the incentives for a woman to join the labor force are going to be reduced. It's not a complicated story, but this, because we have the same thing in the United States, as it sounds like we kind of hit a plateau in terms of women's labor force participation, and then that hasn't gone up since hitting that plateau. The plateau might be a little higher, but it does seem intertwined with this inequality issue that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I also had a comment on your paper on the informal sector, which is intriguing. I don't know much about the Indian labor force, but I know in the US, economic historians have, I agree with you that each country's history is very unique, and we need to, take each case separately for the forces that are operating. In the US, one of the factors that really, this great leveling of inequality was what they called the Great Compression, which was a result of World War II, when labor markets that had been somewhat informal and very localized, and a lot of inequality, were kind of brought under federal control for the purpose of gearing up for the war effort. And there was a lot of standardization of wages that happened at that time, and a lot of reduction of inequality that happened at that time, but just for that purely sort of historical, not historical accident, but of this federalization as a result of the war effort, which perhaps didn't happen in India. So you have this more informal, spread out, scattered, regionalized inequality that continues.
Yeah. So I just had a power cut, and then the power just came back. So I'm glad. In terms of the government's efforts to formalize the labor force. The typical argument that I think the typical philosophy that governments follow here is to basically bring out people from agriculture and put them into non-agricultural jobs, because the productivity in the agriculture sector is really low, right? So this is the typical Lewis argument, where there's a low wage sector to high wage sector, and then economic growth is going to take place. But the government has many welfare policies that try to do something similar to what you were talking about. But there are many complicated issues. Firstly, there's the regional thing, similar to what you mentioned. There is corruption. So there's a lot of literature on impact evaluation. People like Abhijit Banerjee and others have developed, where they try to figure out how to basically undergo this formalization system, right? So the government has spent a lot of money, and in many cases, a lot of these organizations have also spent a lot of money. But it is still, the jury is still out with regard to how much of that has actually been effective in reducing these inequalities, is what I'll say.
Yeah, and in the U.S., it took an event as dramatic as going to war mobilization to get the political will and to do that. So yeah, it's not not obvious that it can just be mandated by the government.
Abhijit Banerjee famously described these informal sector entrepreneurs as residual entrepreneurs, amounting to nothing but residual. And of course, there's been studies beyond that talk about the impact on the next generation. So maybe, your father was delivering eggs and bread to various homes, but they put you to school. And so social mobility, you see a rise in social mobility, which I think, I'm not sure a randomized control trial can look at that, but good idea there. Mark, would you have any questions, or didn't mean to crowd you out?
I'm just interested, well, because my interest is, as I said, more in levels of poverty than in levels of inequality. And I would like to know more about the Indian context and what poverty, like if the trend is positive or negative, and what those numbers look like relative to what we have in the United States.
Yeah, I don't actually know that, but the point that Meenakshi just mentioned in terms of social mobility, it is definitely a factor. So anecdotal evidence, if you simply look at, the demographic of students, let's say, who come into a private university like ourselves, or in general, what is the son or the daughter doing relative to what their parents were doing? You can simply say that just from that, you can say that, the relative income levels are going up because of constant economic growth since the 90s. Economic growth has been quite robust. It has declined recently, but in the 90s and in the early 2000s, it was, growing 8-9% pretty much every year. But the fruits of economic growth have not been distributed equally across the groups, right? So upper caste or traditionally people who have political representation, they have cornered more of this growth, which is why the graph that Professor Jones showed is the way it is. And that itself is, a lot of economists say that, in some sense, that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And India has a really huge middle class, right? So the middle class, in many ways, also elects the governments in power. So the policies often are, pro the middle class. That's kind of like a short answer to your question. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think, well, it's a good short answer. It's a good short answer. Yeah. When I was thinking about this material, like the levels of poverty in the United States are astonishing, given the overall wealth of the country. And like are the levels of poverty in India similar? Like the numbers I showed in that chart, and it was a chart ultimately Stacy pointed me to a few months ago, something like 40 million Americans live below the poverty line, which would be, I guess, almost like a seventh of the United States. Is that roughly right, Stacy? Those numbers?
That is right. I mean, I think your question about, is poverty the problem or is inequality the problem is something that a lot of people have grappled with, right? And actually the meaning of poverty. I mean, what does poverty mean in a country when 99% of households have a television set?
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about relative poverty. And I think, it's a real challenge for economists because, our theories tend to say it's what you have in absolute terms that matter. But our knowledge of human nature and some economic studies suggest it's not what you have in absolute terms that matter. It's the difference between people, which means a country could be sort of very wealthy in absolute terms, like 99% of people having televisions and electricity, and yet some people feeling themselves to be not part of society in some way, or too poor to participate meaningfully in society, which is why I think the European Union definition, I don't have it word for word in my head, but the European Union definition of poverty is having the means to participate meaningfully in your society, which could be a pretty high bar in terms of material well-being, but it's having, you know, having the material means to be a meaningful participant in your society.
Yeah, and the Rawls way of putting that would be having the things that you need in order to formulate a plan for your life and act on it.
It would also be the Amartya Sen view of having the capabilities. Capabilities. And you know, Raphael Bostic actually with the Federal Reserve has pointed out that an inclusive economy quite fundamentally is a productive economy. So if you do not have access to these, no matter, you might have a television set, but if you don't have access to other opportunities, and the lack of opportunities actually self-perpetuates, it replicates over time. So, you know, social mobility is actually declining in the United States. And I was heartened to hear from Shaumadip that that doesn't seem to be the case in India. What I think is that we all have so much here that maybe we should contribute and work on a paper together where we look at maybe relative differences or how we interpret relative poverty levels, and, you know, quite frankly, look at the question of inequality. Is the only moral objection to inequality the fact that it perpetuates poverty, i.e. the unequal access to goods and services in society?
So I went relatively quickly, but there are these two things happening in Rawls' discussion of inequality. One is this question about whether or not people have fair equality of opportunity. One is this question about, given fair equality of opportunity, what do outcomes look like? And he's making exactly the distinction you're making, Meena, which is that someone could have what he calls formal equality of opportunity, which means it's illegal to discriminate in any way. But just because that's illegal doesn't mean that everyone actually has real opportunity. And it's this movement from formal to fair equality of opportunity that's doing the work in that last passage that I quoted. And that, I think, is the right thing to look at.
And I know we have to open it up to audience questions, but there's also the role of the state that Shaumadip brought up. There's also a role of state in taxing, right? And where should, and that's Piketty's argument about fair taxation, or having the rich pay up to break up this concentration of wealth, and income, of course, perpetuates wealth at the top. And where does that go? I know democracies need the middle class to survive, but in the United States, the middle class is actually shrinking. So, you know, the vote banks are actually going down. And so the state is abdicating its role, I feel, in a certain way. Using the word tax or progressive is actually considered a slur. So maybe we could have talked more about that, but I'm aware that Chavi's telling me that we have 3 minutes left. Are there any pressing questions from the audience that we might take in the next, or we can continue to jabber? There was one that came up in the chat for you, Stacy, about something. I think I shared it with you. Would you? I think you had to talk a little bit about some argument about Alexander Fraser Tytler. I don't know what. It's some cycle. It's some nations go through cycles or something like that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that particular theory, but I know that people do talk about, you know, Branko Milanovic in the inequality context talks about this idea of a Kuznets wave. You know, that Simon Kuznets. Yeah. Actually, he's got the elephant too, but the elephant isn't the same wave, right? That's the global inequality picture with the middle class sort of falling out, the global middle class, but. Yeah, here just saying, you know, you're going to get this rising inequality to a point where there's a political backlash, and then you're going to get falling inequality, and then, you know, and then you'll get rising inequality, but, you know, this kind of wave-like cycle. But I don't think there's a prediction for a particular wavelength in terms of the timing, and I think there's a lot of room in that theory for each nation to have its own, as Thomas Piketty said, you know, intimate history of inequality, just, you know, within this sort of wave, you know, this, just like in politics, right? We see right, left, you know, in inequality the same. Yeah.
There's another question for you, Stacy. Do you see it in the chat?
I don't, I'm afraid. Where am I? What am I missing here?
I can read it out to you.
Sure, thanks.
It's Stacy said that it was education that played a key role in addressing inequality. But in the current time, despite easier access to education, inequality is increasing. Is education becoming irrelevant in addressing inequality?
I think in the US context, I think a lot of the conversation is about the quality of education. And that when we're measuring education, oftentimes in economics, we're just measuring it in years. And when we look at the actual resources going into students' education, there's a big difference in the resources going into students' education, depending on where they're starting on the economic ladder. There is an active movement for universal preschool because we know, James Heckman and other researchers have found that, the earlier the investment, the greater the payoff. And so there seem to be some folks pushing to equalize education, but I think right now the distribution of education is contributing to inequality.
We could talk a lot about education as well, because is it education or the creation of jobs at the end of the pipeline that matter? Education for education's sake or the quality of it. But we are out of time. I'm getting a signal from the organizers that we have actually exceeded our time. But thank you so much. I learned a lot. I hope this was productive and worth getting up early in the morning, Stacy and Mark. And Shomadip, so sorry that you had to face those challenges of power grid shortages, but I think we had a productive discussion. And if anybody on this chat has a question that they would like to talk about to any of the presenters, please let us know. Chavi or anyone else from this group would happily, I'm sure, forward those questions to us. All right, take care, everyone, and thanks again for being such active participants. Take care. Bye.
Thank you for the opportunity. Yeah. Bye-bye.